At the end of World War II, American leaders had a problem. In particular, they had a serious worry. And they were worried that after the victory, it was clear that victory was coming to the American side. After the victory, the United States economy might plunge back into the depression from which the war, or more precisely, spending by the American government on the war, had rescued it. So here's the situation. Here's what they observed. The economy had been in depression since the very beginning of the 1930s. And the depression continued until the very end of the 1930s, even into 1940, when the U.S. government, fearing that a war might be coming, began spending hand over fist for military preparations, buying planes and trucks and bullets and boots and bayonets and all the stuff for war. And this war spending had begun to pull the United States out of the Depression even before Pearl Harbor, even before the United States got directly involved in the fighting. Well, and once the United States got involved in the fighting, then military spending went through the roof. Until by 1944, American military spending was over a third of the gross domestic product, so GDP. That's the total output of the American economy. And military spending claimed a third of that. This was way higher. This was 20 times higher than it had ever been in American history before this. And it had these enormous effects on the economy. The economy was pulled out of the Depression, and the economy thrummed along as it never had before. And this was great. America was prosperous once again. The American people were employed. People were happy. They had homes. They had, well, what people want to have from an economy. They had what they wanted to get from a government. And American leaders realized, okay, the end of the war is coming. And there are two bad things, potentially bad things, that are going to happen upon the end of the war. The millions of men and a modest number of women who were in uniform are going to be mustered out. Now, what that's going to do is going to flood the market with new people looking for jobs. That by itself is going to threaten another depression because it's going to raise the unemployment rate dramatically. And when these people get out of the military, they're no longer going to get military paychecks. They're no longer going to be on the government payroll. And a question is, will the private economy be able to pick up where the government leaves off? Beyond this is the fact that everybody understood that at the end of the war, the big spending by the government on war preparations and war operations, that's going to go away. It had after every previous war. So when government spending goes way down, from a third of GDP to maybe back what it was before, 2 or 3% of GDP. And as the supply of workers goes up, then it looks like this is a recipe for disaster. So what are we going to do to prevent this? This problem was something that kept officials in the U.S. Treasury Department awake nights. It kept people in the State Department, it kept people in the White House awake nights, and nobody quite knew what the answer to this was. There were various measures, policies that were pursued to prevent this collapse of the economy into depression again. One was the pursuit of free trade. So the United States began to make very clear that its attitude toward trade in the post-war period would be to loosen up trade restrictions. American policymakers looked back on the interwar period, especially the 1930s, and saw there was a time when countries were raising tariffs one against the other. And this had contributed to a trade war which helped cause a collapse in international trade. So if the American government was on board with free trade, then that would encourage other countries to do the same thing. And the United States in 1945 was in a position where it could essentially dictate the rules of the road in economic affairs. And it did. And it wrote free trade into the international norm, into the international regime. The United States created institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The United States sponsored the United Nations. The United States helped create the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which gave rise to the World Trade Organization. All of these were in the service of freeing up trade. And the whole idea was free trade will give American manufacturers the opportunity to find foreign markets, because Americans were so productive that they produced far more than Americans could consume. And so they're going to have to find outlets for this production, and foreign markets were a place to do it. And the United States tried to write free trade into its policies toward other countries. So the Marshall Plan, which was a scheme by which the United States gave money to reconstruction money to European governments to rebuild after the war. But the money was premised in part on agreements among the European nations to buy into this free trade regime. Anyway, this was one possibility. And the policymakers kind of crossed their fingers, hope for the best. And there's, beyond just looking back to the 1930s, there was a historical reason for worrying about this. It comes from two directions. One is that the United States had this history of spending a lot of money during wartime, and then when the war was over, just stopped spending the money on the military. So the U.S. government, under Continental Congress, spent lots of money fighting the Revolutionary War, and when the war was over, the soldiers were all mustered out, and the military spending stopped. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, World War I, so on. And you could see these spikes upward in government spending, and then it came down after the war. And the spikes up of the government spending during war did basically stimulate the economy, and the economy really got going. And very often, in fact, it was the norm rather than the exception, after wars, there would be a depression or a recession, or at least a period of economic turmoil. This had been the case after pretty much every war in American history until then, and there was a fear that it was going to come again after World War II, and it would probably be worse after World War II, because World War II was a bigger war, and the American injection of money from the government was a bigger deal then than ever before. So the U.S. economy is going to go cold turkey after the war, and it's going to cause this horrible recession. So there was that historical angle to it. But there was something else. There was deeper concern about American industrial capitalism, American capitalism. A brief reminder. The United States has a capitalist economy, or, well, sort of. It's a mixed economy now, but capitalism in the United States developed in the 19th century, between about 1800 and 1900. Capitalism is based on private property and private markets, and individuals making decisions not determined by government, but by themselves, by customers, vendors, and so on. The whole idea of capitalism is to keep government out of things and let individuals make their own decisions on their own. And the argument goes that individuals know better about what they want, what they can afford, and so on than government does. And a capitalist economy, a market-based economy, is more flexible. So you don't get these dictates from Washington or someplace far away, and you don't get the bureaucrats getting involved. And it's more nimble, it can make changes. Sure, there are ups and downs to the economy, but they usually sort themselves out. Or do they? So that was the question. So the United States economy became fully capitalist really only after the Civil War. And the Civil War was another moment when the government injected tons of money into American industry, in those days even into the American farm sector, and the economy just roared as a result. It's like putting bellows into a fire, just pumping oxygen in there and throwing some additional fuel on the fire, and off it goes. And after the war, then there was a curtailment, and after the war, the Industrial Revolution really took off in America. But the Industrial Revolution, which for the most part raised standards of living and increased GDP, but it was also marked by cycles, booms and busts, ups and downs. And so if you looked at the way the economy performed after the Civil War, so it was going up from the Civil War, so there's a rising curve, and then there was a financial crisis in 1873. It was called the Panic of '73. It was basically when Wall Street had a seizure, and people couldn't pay their debts, and banks went under, and it led. So we're climbing to 1873, and then the economy nosedives, and it goes down through the end of the 1870s. And so from 1873, early 1874, until 1879, almost 1880, the country was in a depression. We would call it, in modern terms, we would call it a recession because that's not quite so depressing a term. So the economy, it went up, but then it went down. And then it started climbing again during the 1880s. And then there was another panic in 1893, and in 1893, boom, it went down again. And this time it went down farther and faster than before. It was like a roller coaster. It went up and then down. And whereas real roller coasters have their biggest hill at the beginning, and then they go down, and the other ones, because they're mostly operating under gravity, they get smaller and smaller. In the case of the American economy, starting in about 1865, the end of the Civil War, the roller coaster humps and hollows were getting bigger and bigger. So it goes up in the 1870s and then down, the Depression of the late 1870s. It goes up in the 1880s, and then it goes down during the 1890s. It goes down deeper and more sharply than before. And then it climbed up again. It was going down. It started going down after 1907. And then in the beginning of 1914, it was in a recession. It was down. But then comes government spending on World War I. It goes up again. And then it goes down again in the 20s. But then at the end of the 20s, it goes up higher than ever before. This was the stock market boom of the 1920s and the roaring 20s and all this. So in 1929, it's at a peak. And then 1930, the crash of 1929, 1930s, it went down farther and longer than ever before. So it was like a pendulum. And it was a pendulum that was swinging farther and farther and farther from prosperity to depression, prosperity to depression. But whereas real pendulums, they go, you start them off, and they go back and forth, and they gradually dampen, and they get smaller and smaller. This was one where there was something that was fueling this, that was giving it an extra nudge each time, or so it seemed. And so, again, the pendulum goes this way, and then 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 this way, until you get to the 1930s. And when it goes into the recession, into the depression of the 1930s, well, that one lasted longer than any depression before. It was deeper than any depression before, and here's the key. It didn't pull out. After every one of the previous depressions, the economy had righted itself, and it seemed as though there was some kind of self-correcting mechanism in American capitalism, and theorists of capitalism would come up with concepts, theories of the business cycle. And the way it would work is that when times are good, people bid up prices of things, and they make investments, and they make speculations, and things get better and better and better. And then something happens. It might be just a loss of confidence in this or that. It might be the fortuitous collapse of some business. And then people get spooked, and the bubble bursts, and everybody runs for the exits, and then it goes down. But gradually, there's an overshoot on the downside, and people realize, oh wait, the economy's, America is still a good place to do business, and so they start investing again. And so the idea of the business cycle is it goes up, and then it goes down, and it goes up, and then it goes down. And if you're a believer in capitalism, then you tend to believe that the business cycle corrects itself, and it doesn't need the help of government getting out. And in the Depression of the 1930s, there were people who said, just let the government keep its hands off of the economy. This depression is going to cure itself. Herbert Hoover, the Republican president at the time of the stock market crash and for the first 2.5 years of the Depression, was of this belief. Now, in fact, Hoover did more than he's often credited with doing. He did make some efforts, but for the most part, he thought the government should not meddle too much in the economy. There is a cycle to these things, and we just have to wait this one out. There are bad businesses that need to be wrung out of the economy. There are bad debts that need to be wrung out of the economy. And yes, it's a painful transition, but we will be the stronger for having gone through it. So this was the thinking of orthodox conservatives and Republicans like Hoover. But there were others of both parties who wondered if, I was talking about this pendulum or this roller coaster, if maybe the roller coaster had gotten out of control. Now, going to the other end of the political spectrum, there were Marxists who had been predicting the collapse of communism. And they talked about these contradictions within capitalism itself. And capitalism would, the pendulum or the roller coaster, would finally get out of control and it would just crash. And to use the roller coaster model, the whole superstructure would fall down. Or use the pendulum model, it would just fly out of control. Or to use another model, when I was in high school, and maybe this is still true in high school physics classes, there was a video that my teacher would play, and it's played in a lot of physics classes, of a bridge, a suspension bridge over the Tacoma Narrows in the state of Washington. And it was a bridge that was built in a way that tended to catch the wind more than the engineers expected that it would. And when the high winds would blow through this narrow strait, the bridge, this suspension bridge made out of steel cables and concrete girders and all this stuff, it would start to swing. It was a very heavy bridge, but it would still start to swing. And the video that was played in all of these physics classes, you can see it on YouTube, shows the bridge swinging farther and farther and farther and farther as it resonates to the beat of the winds going through. And farther and farther and farther until finally the cables, the concrete, the trusses, and everything can no longer hold. And the thing just crashes down into the water. So with this as a potential model, maybe this is what had happened to American capitalism. Maybe the 1930s, the Depression of the 1930s, represented not just another business cycle, but the terminal business cycle. Things had really gone off the rails. And maybe it never was going to pull out of this. Now, as I say, conventional wisdom, like that of Herbert Hoover, said it would do it, and it would have done it except for that dastardly Franklin Roosevelt came along and started meddling in the government, scaring off investors and sound business thinkers and so on. Now, this was a fairly self-serving argument for Hoover to make, because basically what he was saying is, I was on the right track all along, and Roosevelt was wrong. And nobody could prove that Hoover was wrong because the course that he recommended was not followed. In fact, he did. He went to his grave in the 1960s saying, if Roosevelt had simply done what I told him to do, then all would have been well. And the Depression would have gone away earlier. Well, the Depression didn't go away. And in fact, Roosevelt really didn't do that much in the way of meddling in the economy. So what happened? Well, the economy stayed in the Depression through the 1930s. And maybe it would have stayed in the Depression forever. That's the thing. That's the thing that worried those thinkers in the government during the 1940s. Maybe this modern industrial economy, maybe capitalism in the industrial age is a dead end. And maybe it simply can't sustain itself. Well, in fact, in 1945, the economy was doing really well. But why was it doing well? That was the question. And one of the answers was, because we're spending lots of money. Now, it just so happened that probably the most distinguished theorist of economics in the 1930s, a British fellow named John Maynard Keynes, had been arguing during the Depression that the way out of the Depression is greater government spending. When the economy is underperforming, the private economy is underperforming, then government needs to step in and provide demand, that is spending, that private individuals are not doing on their own. And the idea is that, okay, if in basic terms a depression is a situation in which there is greater production capacity than there is demand. People aren't buying enough stuff. So if people aren't buying enough stuff, said Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, then the government should buy the stuff. And that will put people back to work. That will get the economy going again. And it's like sort of kick-starting a car that, all right, motorcycle, then once it gets going, then it sustains itself. So Keynes had been preaching this gospel of deficit spending during a depression for some years. But no one was quite willing to take him at his word, to do all the spending that he recommended. It's true that the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression did spend more than it took in. It engaged in deficit spending. But as I suggested earlier, the deficits were pretty small. Really, it's too small to get the economy going again. It's like a little kid is trying to kickstart the motorcycle and he just doesn't have the power to do it. But then, and here's the key, then along comes World War II, and the government really does inject lots of money, even more than Keynes would have recommended. And that really, then it's like a big hulking guy can kickstart that motorcycle and boom, away it goes. So it appeared on the basis of what happened during the early 1940s, during World War II, that Keynesianism, this idea of deficit spending during Depression, is great. It really does restart the economy. And there we go. But here again, we come back to this problem. What happens when you take away the government spending? That's what was going to happen after World War II, because everybody expected that the army's coming home, the soldiers are getting mustered out, there aren't going to be any more orders for, you're not going to buy any more bombers or tanks or all that stuff. We don't need it during peacetime. The American tradition had been get rid of the army during peacetime. Part of this was economizing. We don't want to spend money on an army when we don't have to. Another part was suspicion of standing armies, of soldiers and officers standing around with nothing to do. Well, if they got nothing to do, they start to think of things to do. And one of the things that standing armies had done historically was to take over governments. And Americans didn't want that to happen. So this is why they got rid of their armies after the war, after whatever war. And this was what was fully expected after World War II. And it started to happen. So most of the American soldiers in the Army in 1945 and in the Navy, there wasn't yet a separate Air Force, they were mustered out. They were handed their last paycheck, they were sent home, and they went about their business. But World War II, unlike the American Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II did not give way to a period of settled peace. It gave way to the Cold War. And the Cold War wasn't a hot war. For the most part, Americans weren't getting killed in battle. There were exceptions, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. But the United States, American leaders, and the American people believed that the United States needed to continue spending on the military because there was this Soviet threat. Now, the spending didn't start right after World War II. There was a period when spending went down. And in fact, there were these post-war transition problems. Not only had the demand fallen, but there were other demands by workers to have pay increases. During the war, wages by and large were frozen. The government said you can't raise wages during the war because this would prevent workers, unions, from going on strike and forcing up wages. During the war, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, during the war, the government basically ran the economy. And it said, okay, this is what the wage scale is, this is what the price scale is, and so on. War's over and those things get taken off. And so there were these unsettled moments at the end of the war. And there was concern that, okay, maybe that depression that we saw coming is actually coming. But then came the Korean War in the early 1950s. And the Korean War made it look as though the Cold War was turning hot. And military spending had gone from 35% of GDP to below 10% when the Korean War broke out. And when the Korean War broke out, all of a sudden, American leaders said, wait a minute. We might need some of those soldiers back. We might need some more airplanes. We might need the stuff of war. We hoped that we could convert to peace, but in this Cold War, there's the possibility at any moment that the Cold War might turn hot, that we might have to go to the war with the Soviets. So we need to be ready. And so what happened is, after from this high of 35% of GDP in 1944, 1945, it plunged to below 10%, but then it climbed again. And during the 1950s, the American spending, federal spending on the military and things related to the military, hovered around 10%. And so the thing that the policymakers had feared in the 1940s, that when government spending on the military goes away, the economy will go into a depression. Well, the economy didn't go into a serious depression. There were some down moments, but on the whole, the economy did well during the 1950s and 1960s. And so, did it demonstrate that American capitalism was fundamentally sound, that Herbert Hoover was right, that all we have to do is be patient and the economy will recover? Well, no, it didn't prove that because that military spending never went away. There wasn't that yanking of the injection of the stimulants to the economy. The economy didn't have to go cold turkey. Capitalism didn't have to go cold turkey after the war. For decades after the war, for the length of the Cold War, the United States government continued to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defense. And so it was, well, the experiment, if that's the right term, of what would happen when the war ends and the spending is withdrawn. The spending was never withdrawn. And so there was no way of telling if the economy would have righted itself on its own, the way it had after previous depressions. The business cycle, the thinking of the business cycle apparently was sound and things got fixed. But this time it didn't happen because the government kept its hand on the scales and kept injecting money into the economy. At first, through military spending. And one of the reasons that military spending is attractive from the standpoint of getting the government to spend money in order to keep the economy afloat is that while plenty of people will debate the merits of government spending on higher education or on national parks or on school lunches or on Medicare or whatever it might be, almost nobody can mount an effective argument against spending money that appears necessary for national defense. That's the first priority. That's the highest responsibility of government, is to defend the country. And so when government would propose, here's the big Pentagon budget, almost nobody was willing to stand up in Congress and say, forget it, we don't need it, because you would be seen as potentially opening the country up to danger. The communists might take over. You could be categorized as downright unpatriotic. There was something else that went on too, and this underlines a fundamental principle of politics. It certainly shows up in the United States, but it happens in other countries. And the principle is this: when a program or some object of spending doesn't exist, when a program doesn't exist, it has relatively few constituents. But once the program does exist, all of a sudden, it has lots of people who will fight tooth and nail to keep it going. So, once the country got in the Cold War habit of spending lots of money on the military, then there was great resistance to cutting spending. In the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, a general, hero of World War II. If anybody knows about the military, about military spending, it's Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower tried to cut the military budget, but Congress refused. Congress said, no, we need to spend all that stuff. Well, do we really need to spend all this stuff? Because if you cut spending, then people who work in defense factories in my congressional district are going to be out of jobs. And we don't want that to happen. So military spending on the Pentagon, became part of a full employment package. And the result was that it appeared that American capitalism had grown dependent on military spending. The American capitalism depended on the Pentagon to keep going. Now, it is true that by the end of the Cold War, the spending on the military had gone down to 5% or even less. But by then there were new programs, new federal programs, that put spending up. And so in the 21st century, American government spending has been traditionally above 30% of GDP, about the level it was back in World War II. And so what conclusion can we draw from this? Can we say that capitalism would have recovered? Capitalism would have fulfilled Herbert Hoover's prediction? The answer is we don't know. The way capitalism developed was it developed into, well, not to put too fine a term on it, American capitalism became partly capitalist and partly socialist, because the part of any economy that has the government in charge of the spending is an essentially socialist part of the economy. Now, socialism is often a dirty word in American politics, and so people don't want to use that. But basically, when you're talking about the public sector, that's what socialism is. Socialism is an economy where the public sector is very large. In a capitalist economy, the public sector is very small or non-existent. But the United States has not had anything like a fully capitalist economy, at least since the beginning of World War II. And so one could make an argument that the American economy, American capitalism, got hooked on, call it the drug of government spending, and it's never been able to get off it. And the result is that capitalism, as it's called today, isn't anything like the capitalism of the 1920s, and it's not what a lot of people like to think capitalism is or should be.